symbolizes and depicts the inseparability of male and female energies of creation. Let us strive to celebrate the equality with equity as the theme of today goes, invest in women, accelerate progress. Well, nobody can touch words, but words do touch everybody. We are a master of our unspoken words and slaves of our spoken words. The significance of words, along with the amalgamation of spirituality and culture. So, with this, we have a very vibrant, versatile, and vehement woman with me who is who always wanted to play with words. And her versatility will be told by her itself. So may I please welcome on my behalf of Rupkatha, behalf of this cultural event, as well as a very special Women's Day to a very special woman, Madam Arundhati. So most welcome, ma'am. So I hope you are doing great.
I'm very well. Thank you, Swayamprabha. I'm delighted to be here. It's a wonderful way to be speaking this morning.
Pleasure is all mine. So let us begin the conversation. I'm super excited to know more about you, and I'm sure the audience who are with us. So can we start with, could you just tell me about your early life and your inclination towards writing and everything about you, which I think most of us are very inquisitive to know. Thank you.
I'm not sure everyone's inquisitive. I mean, there's nothing terribly exciting about my early life, Swayamprabha, other than the fact that I was excited about poems. And I believe almost every second child is, It's very difficult to emerge into the verbal universe at the age of 2 and 3 and not be excited about the way language moves. Whether it's in a nursery rhyme or a little piece of nonsense verse that you learn in your, in the local language, there's an immediate excitement about language. I think we all feel it. Everyone feels it, but I believe that unfortunately, many of us are encouraged to quell that essential, innate, spontaneous excitement. In my case, that excitement endured. I think that's about the only difference, really. It endured and it deepened, and it led me to places that I hadn't quite imagined much later in my life. So initially, I would say, as a child, it was an excitement about kinetic language, language that was capable of dancing, language that was capable of sounding like music. So there was that excitement. Later on, inevitably, in my adolescence, it became a tool of self-expression. It felt like poetry was a place where you could express every conceivable inconvenient emotional upsurge in your life. This is again not terribly original. Every person does this. There is no one who's past the age of 16 who hasn't written a poem. Everyone does it. The strange thing, though, is that we're often encouraged to believe that poetry is an adolescent form, and you graduate from that to what really counts, which in the conventional hierarchy of forms is prose. That's the adult form. So everyone else, I suspect, graduated. It's just that I didn't. I'm still exactly where I was, which is with a love of poetry as a kind of dance, as a kind of music, as a kind of, certainly as a means of self-expression. But above all, I think I was fascinated, and still am, by poetry as the swiftest, most pleasurable, verbal route to myself that I know. It still remains that, because it's a form of such distillation that it compels you in some way to inhabit yourself as deeply as you can, and not to settle for easy answers.
Yeah, that's very true. When we, me being a student of literature, have always studied this Wordsworth, poetry of Wordsworth. Daffodils, a very famous poem, and we see the dancing of the daffodils. As you state, that poetry always depicts some sort of a dance, some sort of a, outburst of emotions.
But I'd say poetry doesn't depict a dance. Poetry is the dance.
Okay.
Depicting is a portrayal. Poetry is that language that dances. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, fantastic. So similarly, many of our romantic poets also wrote something which, of course, again, sorry to say, not depicting but portraying the form of dance.
It is the
Okay.
dance, is what I'm saying. I'm saying not
Okay.
portrayal.
Okay. So it's a kind of
Is
a version of dance. Is
it's
that so?
music. It's I believe it is language in motion. That's what makes it
Okay.
kinetic language. That's what makes it different from what you and I are doing right now, which is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a much more pedestrian conversation. We are just trying to exchange a certain idea in a certain way.
Absolutely.
Whereas
Absolutely.
poetry is language that takes wing. It's language that's capable of playing with grace and gravity.
Absolutely. So that's very true. But then I see some of your poems, and I see a lot of things about women. Like, does your poem celebrate women? And okay, we can go to that later. But supposing about the books of cleaning shelves and where I live. So could you
On
just tell
cleaning,
me some, yeah,
on
on
cleaning bookshelves.
cleaning,
Mhm.
yeah, bookshelves and where I live. So could you
Mhm.
just tell us what was basically the idea of writing this?
Well, I mean, that's difficult to answer. I mean, On Cleaning Bookshelves was my very first book of poems. So it was the work of almost a decade and more. And it's an exuberant book of poems, I think. It's um, it's full of it explores different themes, it explores different tones. It's about cities, it's about relationships, it's about cultural politics, it's about gender politics, it's about loss, it's about the existential journey, it was a variety of themes, many of which still remain very important to me. That book is important to me because it was my very first book ever. So
Absolutely.
that's an important book.
Yeah,
So I go back to it sometimes, and I probably would do some of it differently, but it is an important book for me. Where I Live was my second book of poems.
yes, yes.
That appeared in 2005. And I feel by then, thematically, something had grown more focused. And I feel the central preoccupation in Where I Live was belonging in some way, the idea of belonging to the body or not quite belonging to the body, belonging to a cultural milieu or not quite belonging to a cultural milieu, belonging to a country or not quite belonging to a country, belonging, so it was exploring the notion of belonging physically, culturally, politically. What does it mean really to inhabit the self? What does it mean to inhabit a nation? What does it mean to inhabit a culture, a political moment? And above all, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be you? What does it really mean to? I think that's when the existential questions also come back. So I sometimes feel I've been dealing with the same set of themes forever, Swayamprabha.
That's fantastic. So, as you said, there's a lot of, things as cultural politics, gender politics. So, like, what inspires you or what makes you to write this? Is it the, juxtaposition that all of us are facing these days? Is it the conflicting ideas that is coming, which we can see in the total scenario in the environment, that there's so much of conflict, confusions. So, is it something to do with that? Or is it again, as you say, it is just a kind of feelings that you express?
No, I mean, I think the two are not separate. I mean, the feelings that you express are never separate from the world you live in. So there is really nothing like an isolated poet, right? I mean, you may, even someone who chooses to write about the pastoral landscapes of her time, and we know many of the romantic poets that you mentioned did that, was certainly very aware of what was going on politically, and were actually making a political statement by not writing about that in their poetry. We know Robert Frost could have written
Yes.
about the industrialized world he lived in, but chose not to. And that in itself becomes a political comment. So I think, I would like to sort of expand our idea, even as we talk about what it means to be political, which doesn't necessarily mean waving a flag about some particular party or any such thing, but it's really about seeing that in some way the idea of power creeps up into our lives and often creates very imbalanced equations. Whether it's on the basis of gender, we're certainly aware of that. Whether you're writing about, I mean, the whole feminist credo, the personal is the political, comes out of that understanding, doesn't it? that you can't separate the two. So I think to separate feeling from politics is in fact a binary that's created by people who don't quite understand what it's about. The two are not separate. You know, the two are very deeply connected. So I'd say that from my very first book, if I were to look back on a poem in my very first book called 546 Andheri Local, it's about traveling on a Pika Bombay local train. You know, is that political? I don't think so. And yet it is. Why? Because there is a certain way the poem talks about a journey from a great sense of distaste or unease at being in this situation packed with a bunch of women whom one doesn't know. And it talks about that sense of being part of an indistinguishable whole, part of a collective that I don't belong to. And at the same time, there is a surge of power. So the collective becomes something one is uneasy with, but it also becomes a source of power and strength. So I think right from a poem like that, I do believe that the preoccupation with gender politics has always existed, Swayamprabha. In my very first book on cleaning bookshelves that you mentioned, I think there are many such poems, that talk about unease at power equations, but at the same time, I'd say what I'm more interested in today is expressing that unease, but also realizing that what can sometimes seem like an irreconcilable conflict can on occasion in poetry, these can come together in a kind of inspired paradox, and you can turn a battle into a festival. And I'm more interested in that, I think, today. I loved the fact that you began by also invoking Mahashivaratri today. It is International Women's Day. It is also Mahashivaratri. And the archetype of Shiva that we have, culturally, is the archetype of this tremendous figure that is often conceived iconographically as male, but as you point out, a figure that was fully capable of integrating the feminine, and did not see the consort as separate, but saw the consort as an integral part of him. That idea really is a powerful image, and not just as kind of a clever cliche or a slogan to bandy about, but really, if we think about it, I think it's an invitation to integration, which is really what I think we are all which we are all aspiring to.
Absolutely. When you said that, it's something very interesting to know that when you said that the conflict, you would try to make it to a festival. Absolutely. And, I have listened to Devdutt Patnaik also. He's a mythologist, and he also says that making it from Ranabhumi to Rangabhumi. So that's what, of course, I think all of us will really look forward to. Nevertheless, we are in a tumultuous, scenario as of now. Yeah. So, now this, when we move forward, I feel, the second thing that you said, my belongingness. Okay. So that where do I belong to? So, each time we are in a dichotomy that what to do and what not to do, or what am I and what am I for? Okay. So, so how do you relate this? Is your poem has some sort of a relevance to that? And one more thing, it comes to my mind that human existence is human beings are a coexistence of self and body. So do we take self as a different parameter and body as a different parameter? Self as someone who is guiding the consciousness, okay, which suggests or instructs our body to work, okay, and as per the instructions, our body takes course. So, is it something related to that, or could you just, speak something on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I'm going to try not to answer it by just, quoting from some text or the other. I want to try and relate this, because that's really my business as a writer and a poet, to try and relate this to my own experience. So let me say this. Let me try and answer this as tangibly, as concretely as I can, which is to say that there was a time in my life when it seemed imperative for me to deepen a spiritual journey. And perhaps, without quite articulating it, perhaps in my mind, I thought of the spiritual journey as something that would turn me into this wonderfully tranquil being, capable of, looking a bit, looking beatific and Buddha-like. That's what I'd have liked to be. And so I started, and the journey deepened. I won't go into the details of the journey. Much of that I've written about. But when that journey deepened, one of the discoveries I made was that instead of turning into this serene and beatific being, a bit of a plaster saint that I'd have liked to become, I was in fact dropped, as I say it, the way I see it, I was dropped into my body more completely than I had ever been before. And I had always prided myself on being a poet, reasonably in touch with my feelings, in touch with my body. I know what all that's about. And no, I realized I was plunged into the body. And it was my realization then, and the Bhakti poets came to my aid, they were my sanctuary and my refuge at the time, because they articulated this. The world outside us often has us believe that we must, in fact, live by this dichotomy that you mentioned of flesh and spirit. You called it body and self, but whatever you call it, whether it's body and the beyond, flesh and, body and God, whatever you want to call it, the world often has us live in very conceptually fragmented ways. But in my experience, the paradox was that as the spiritual practice began to deepen, I was experiencing my body more than anything else. And that's when I realized that there is a reason why we have this extraordinary legacy of poets in the subcontinent whom I had overlooked entirely, and must confess to that. I grew up with, hearing Bhakti poetry, but I just thought of it, I read it superficially, and I just thought of it as a bunch of pious goody-goody songsters, talking about the divine. Nothing prepared me for the appetite for life that I found in their poems. An appetite by which I mean a great, roaring, ferocious appetite for something more. They spoke of hunger, they spoke of sexuality, they spoke of this great scorching need to devour God and be devoured by God. And that's when I realized that these are poems that are erotic, that are argumentative. These are not poems that are tame. They are not poems that are bloodless in any way. So whatever made me think that life and the spirit are separate, whatever made me think that, there is really no way, and that's when I understood that there's really no way into the life of the spirit that doesn't acknowledge the body, that doesn't see the body as the basis, that doesn't see the body as an instrument, because that's what the body is, the instrument of the sacred, not not just when I say instrument, I mean it in the finest possible way, that the body is not a barrier. The body is the basis of the existential journey.
Okay. So do you feel that, spirituality and literature, can they go together, and how? And I can see in few of your poems, your journey through the poems, so a lot of, admixture of this. So how do you, relate this to?
Well, I'd go back to the people whom I just talked about, my Bhakti poets, whom I had, whom I see as my ancestors, really. And I'd never known it. I believed my ancestors ranged, when I was growing up, from TS Eliot to Wallace Stevens and, Elizabeth Bishop and a whole lot of others, the Western models, as well as some wonderful Indian poets, Arundhati Subramaniam and A.K. Ramanujan. All of them were important. But I think I never quite understood that the Bhakti poets were in such a deep sense part of my ancestry. And why? Because they don't tell us that the spiritual and the worldly are at war. They don't tell us that. They speak about physical love, and they speak about romantic love and spiritual love in the same breath. So when you ask me, can it enter literature? My question would be, how can it not? How can it not? If you are deepening your experience of life, which is really what this journey is about, the spiritual journey is about, it's deepening it. It is daring to travel, as I see these poets do, daring to travel to every uncomfortable place in the human heart. That's what this journey is about. Going to every festering crevice of rage, of passion, of love, of jealousy, of disagreement, dissent, also ecstasy, also liberation. But that comes because you've acknowledged all this. You don't sidestep it. So this is not a kind of spiritual bypassing of the human. This is about reaching the ultimate through the human.
Okay. So you feel that it is through the human, like, we have this aham brahmasmi. So that is, that God lives in me. So, so in order to, as I belong to Orissa, I also carry forward the Jagannath culture
Yeah.
with me. So where we say that he's darshaniya, not sparshaniya. So that's because we can see God, but we cannot touch God. So is it something, as you say, is it related to something like that?
Yeah, I'm going to try not to philosophize because, there are lots of philosophers in the world anyway. I'm going to try to look at it as, the title of my book of Bhakti poetry, Swayamprabha, was in fact, to answer your question, it was called Eating God. So it's not about seeing God. The bhaktas are not content with just seeing God. They want to embody the divine. You see the difference? So I think that's not just about resting content with darshan. When you have the stories in our own, we all have those stories, don't we? Marvelous stories about, the shabari who tastes the berries before offering them. This is really about conventional idea of this would be pollution. This would be one traditional idea, but it's not. This is a woman who can taste something before offering it to the one she cares for the most, her God. So, and there are many innumerable stories of this kind. So I'm interested in those who are, in fact, those voices. And my most recent anthology is called Wild Women, which is about those women's voices that question every idea of pollution. They're not interested in just looking at God. They want to embody the divine. They want to become, they want to devour, they want to touch, they want to make love to. That's the bhakta's audacity. You understand? It's absolute audacity. And that's what makes them fascinating. And that's the reason I love to return to them. They're not just content to stand separately and look. It's not a formal relationship with the divine. It's a backslapping relationship with God, where you can eat and be eaten, perhaps, at the same time.
Okay. In one of your poems, you have mentioned about, looking at your mother. Okay. And who is also a lady. So gradually you find the, whatever, when you are observing her, I think that's what I could see, being, not very close to a poet's, I haven't found out my inert nature of being a poet as such. So what I could see from just a reading of your poem, that you have observed her, who is a mother, but at all the characteristics of a lady as well in her. Okay. And so to that, you have some of the, themes of women also in your poems.
No, in many of my poems, that's what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah. So could you just say, how do you see this, depiction of, all these characters in a single woman? And at the same time, having these womanly feelings also, because when we talk of a mother, we say a mother has to always be, all those that is good in her. We can't accept her own, kind of feelings or aspirations. And we always feel that it's not of something, maybe that's a preconditioned mindset that we have. But how do you see this too?
In this poem, or do you mean?
Let us first work on this poem, because that would be great. Like, what do you think about it?
It's a poem called When Landscape Becomes Woman. It's from my most recent book. It's called Love. The book is called Love Without a Story. And I think it's really, it's a moment that I suspect many people have known, which is, most of us think of our parents as the backdrop to our lives as we grow up, right? They're there to provide food and shelter and send us to school and, make sure we are fed when we return and all of that.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of relationship that most children, I think, have. You just take your parents for granted as the backdrop. And there comes a moment when you kind of swivel around and suddenly turn and see that this backdrop is a human being, is a flesh and blood person, a full-fledged human being. It's not about just being a woman, it's about being a full-fledged human being. So that moment, I think, was the moment I was attempting to capture in that poem, where it's a startled moment, actually. There's a bewilderment about it when you suddenly realize that, oh my God, this is a person. And I think that's all the poem was doing. But I think in the process it touches on certain moments that are key. And I think an important line for me in that poem is keyholes always reveal more than doorways.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that is really perhaps in some ways the credo of poetry itself, as I see it. It's not about saying I'm going to sit down and write a poem about the universe. It's not about saying I'm going to sit down and write a political poem. It is you look through this very singular keyhole and you can in fact conjure something much, much larger than simply opening the door and saying I'm going to be vast is going to allow you. Do you see? That ability to move from the singular to the generic, that to me is the excitement of poetry.
Absolutely. That's great. So, could you say your associations to Sadhguru? You have also co-authored a book of Sadhguru. I feel that's a very blessed moment, must have been a very blessed moment. And so when I talk to you also, I feel blessed because since you are blessed with Sadhguru, so some of its reflections are to the entire audience as well. So could you just tell your associations with Sadhguru?
Well, I wrote a book that became his biography in 2010. It was called More Than a Life. And it was preceded by 4 years of very, very intense work, a lot of which was about, conversations with him, which I recorded. A lot of it was about talking to people who had journeyed with him over the years, working with the archival material available. And many years later, so that book happened, the biography happened in 2010. It's a biography that's still very much around and became quite a bestseller in its own right. And subsequently, Sadhguru and I worked on a book together called Adi Yogi. And Adi Yogi is perhaps the right book to be discussing today on Mahashivaratri, because it is a book on, in fact, on the notion of Shiva. And I say notion, for Sadhguru, it is a deep reality. And absolutely. I can only say that this journey with him has been initially quite a roller coaster. Because, life around a mystic is not easy. It's full of surprises, full of lots of moments when you're compelled to question yourself, and lots of moments when you're inclined to question him. This is the journey of faith, really, right? It's potholed with doubt. And but I'll say that when I met him for the very first time in 2004, I felt a certain sense of a deep sense of connect. And I felt that this was the person who could, in fact, address some of the questions I had about living and dying. I felt there was no one else who could do it. At the time, I'd not met anyone, and they were questions that were seething within me. So I approached him with those questions. I actually suggested we go out and have a cup of coffee and discuss them. He asked me to come to the ashram, which I did, and the conversation happened, and it deepened. Working with him has been another kind of roller coaster, but I'd say that he remains, certainly one of the most, he remains the most unusual person I know. There are surprises. It's startling being around him all the time, but there are always the journey of making a book, and we've worked on several together. There are other books of his own that I've helped with. And the process of making a book with him is surprising, but it's never burdensome. It's always, there's a lightness to the process. There's a joy of discovery to the process. And it's always a lubricated journey, if you know what I mean. Nothing cumbersome, and almost never. a couple of occasions when it has been, but almost never tedious work. So, and there's always been the license to question and to ask questions, which to me has been an integral part of my life journey, really.
Okay, that's wonderful. So, of course, talking on your poetry, talking about all this may, go on and go on. So let me just bring you back to, could you just reflect on the today's theme of Women's Day? As you know, the theme goes, that is, invest in women, accelerate progress. Of course, you being a very progressive woman, as I can see, but nevertheless, what is your idea about this particular theme? Is it does it relate to any of the present day society? Are we really not progressing?
I think we are progressing, but we will only progress if our idea of progress becomes inclusive. And I think there is a deep thirst in men and in women. I think in all genders, there is a deep thirst for a less lopsided and more inclusive legacy, for the past, but also a way ahead. We want a way ahead that that doesn't leave anyone out. I think exclusionary ideas cause great pain, not just to the excluded, but also to those doing the exclusion. One of the things that has struck me, and I've been very aware of it in the past few books that I've done, I wrote a book just recently called Women Who Wear Only Themselves, which is about 4 contemporary women on spiritual journeys. And I was struck, Swayamprabha, when that book came out into the world, I was struck by the fact that there were several men who were deeply affected by it. And that strengthens my conviction that, this is not something, any kind of exclusion, any kind of any sort of discrimination is an act of violence, not just to the person or the group that is excluded. It is as much an act of violence to the perpetrator. So no one really wants to be in that place, consciously. No one can be in that place consciously. So what struck me about this book is that, there was a male reader who I heard about just recently, who actually approached one of the women in the book, sat before her and wept. And that's when I realized what an unburdening it is, for many men as well. The need to talk to a woman of strength who has reclaimed herself in a certain way, which is what this monk represented to him, this woman represented. She's a sannyasin. And when he sat with her, he was able to share that vulnerability. So I think, of course it will accelerate progress because we all need it, and we need it more deeply than we know. We need a more equal society, a more just society, a more inclusive society, very deeply, because we are carrying the wounds within us. Each one of us are carrying the wounds within us of centuries of lopsidedness. And, coming back to that wonderful icon that you invoked of on the occasion of Mahashivaratri, of the integrated being, I think that suggests a possible way in which we can address those wounds. That integrated being that doesn't allow anything to be left out, any aspect of the self to be left out. So to me, this is perhaps the way ahead, where we need to acknowledge those dimensions within ourselves as well.
Absolutely, very true. And our mythology also suggests the vibrance of Ma Durga, okay, who is also Shakti, as we discussed. Well, these days we talk a lot about, women equality, gender equality, to be more specific. And of course, at the same time, we talk of equity also. So do you think what is more important, equality or equity?
I don't even know if we should set up hierarchies of this kind. I mean, what is feminism? Let me just go back to something as fundamental as that to me. What has it meant? I'd say it just meant the ability to question, the license to question the many ways in which gender is constructed. Once you realize that gender is constructed, and it's constantly being constructed, and you're constructing it every moment as we are this moment when we speak, I think you start becoming aware of just how much of it is makeshift, how much of it is put together, and therefore how much of it can be dismantled as well. And we are living in a society, I mean, so it has implications for the world in which we live in. And of course, we want the world in which we live to be equal. How else can it be? How else could we possibly have it? I mean, to me, equality is not sameness. Equality is celebrating plurality of every kind, allowing people to invent ways of being themselves just the way they want, and to still belong and to still be included. And I think the recent work that I did, Wild Women, has really been about that. It's been looking at places of in-betweenness in a way, not just about, certainly there are goddess poems. I'm very glad you mentioned the Shakti element. The goddess has meant something very important to me spiritually. So I'm very glad you mentioned her. But I think what I found was, when I started looking at the male poets, some of the male poets, who adopt the female voice, I was struck by just how liberating it is for them. So there are the women mystics who are a part of the book, but there are also the male mystics who choose very often to adopt the female voice, and you realize suddenly hierarchies fall away. Ideas of superiority and equality and inferiority fall away. Suddenly, this woman protagonist in their poems has a remarkably egalitarian relationship with her God. And that conversation, that freedom, that sassiness in her conversation with her God, to me, that is an example of really what it means to be empowered and alive. Whether you're male or female or what have you, it doesn't matter. Just to be empowered and alive, to question and to know that the other, whatever that other is never going to take that amiss. Intimacy is the cornerstone of all sacred poetry. And it reminds us that the closer you get to the object of your desire, in this case, God, it's often mystical union, but the metaphors are of sexual union very often. But that moment of union, as you approach it, you realize all hierarchies fall away. All ideas of equality, as I said, it becomes a festival. It's no longer a battle.
Absolutely. So when we talk, of course, of women equity, that is giving kind of a same status, like, when we, as you very rightly said, that is not getting, having even to talk about that there are some disparity in the status. So they are so equity as we talk about. Now, when we talk about, women liberation and women integrity, so it's always being questioned since time immemorial. When we take her to the mythologies as Sita, so we can have various interpretations now in Mahabharata as Draupadi. So many a times, the integrity, the liberation is always questioned right from then till now. Though this, are the characters of Mahabharata, characters of Ramayana, especially the female characters, were all very powerful. Okay, but nevertheless, this question on integrity, question on liberation was always there, and even it is carried forward to this date. So, what do you think? Like, probably, what according to you, you feel that could be,
My approach to myth is not on the level of, some people feel the need to pick up a story and say, it is my culture, therefore I will deal with it. I don't see it. That's has never been my approach to myth. But I found that the power of myth, and all myth has this, all right? It's not just, I certainly am not making a case for Indian myth alone. I think archetypal figures, by which I mean these great elemental figures who have actually percolated deep into our psyches, and they have emerged from such a deep part of the psyche, even on the part of the creator. Those figures speak to us whether we like it or not. So in my own life, I will give you an example of how I navigate it as a poet. In my own life, sometime in the year 2000, I remember I was in this women poets conference, probably 2000 or 2003, I forget. 2000, I think. I was in a women poets conference in Guwahati, and I remember sitting in my hotel room just after having come back from the Kamakhya temple. And for some reason, I still don't know why, for some reason, I thought of Shakuntala, the character of Shakuntala. And I found myself in tears, and I had no idea why. I'm saying this because I want to tether it to something very concrete. This is how I think myths can ambush you. We often grow up thinking it's a story my grandmother told me.
Absolutely.
But it has, in fact, percolated so deep that there comes a time when it can detonate in your life and remind you of something that you need to listen to, and you don't know what, and you don't know why very often. I didn't know why. I didn't know why Shakuntala made me cry. I spent 10 years trying to find my way into what this archetype was saying to me. And eventually it became a cycle of poems in my book, When God is a Traveler. And I realized in the process of writing those poems that there is a deep wound that Shakuntala represented. That's how I started that poem. I saw her, as I began the poem cycle, I saw her as this being perennially conflicted between, in terms of her parentage. You know, we are told that if you want to get to specifics, she has a sage as one father and an apsara as a mother. And I thought, my God, what a complex, mixed up kid. You know, one parent in heaven and one parent on earth. It must be, you know, it's got to be it's a recipe for disaster. And then I think of her horizontally as well. She's conflicted. There is the forest and there is the court. There is the sage. There is the king. She doesn't quite belong to either. She can never quite go back to either. Where then does she belong? Heaven or earth? Forest or court? Where does she belong? So I started by looking at her centrally as this figure who cannot belong. Until I realized that, like every great mythic character, though she's a cameo in the Mahabharata, she's just a cameo. But often women are cameos. That's the other thing to remember, right? They're just the backdrop. They're the agents who make things happen for the the male protagonists. But if you want to spend time with most of them, as I did, I found you had to dream your way into the lives of women characters in myth. If you dream your way into their lives, you begin to realize that suddenly she represents not a liability. She represents a possibility, and a powerful possibility, because she is the bridge. She is the axis. She is what connects earth and sky. She is what connects forest and court. No one else has this experience. She is the connection. She is the link. And then I began to realize that's really what it means to be human. You know, none of us is just body, none of us is just mind, none of us is just earth, and none of us is just sky. None of us is just one home or the other. We are living in times of multiple identities. And I think that's what the women characters call us to.
Absolutely. And similarly, you know, if we think about Draupadi also, the usual notion goes as Panchali, and we gave her so many names. But if you take her as a woman, a very powerful epitome, you know, a representation of women. And but we do not understand the, you know, thoughts that goes on with that. And so the notional, actually, some way or the other, I think there is some sort of a misinterpretation within the minds of you know, people who are very much preconditioned with these notions and who do not celebrate it as a festival, rather a sort of, you know, marginalizing people. And maybe that could be a reason. Well, before we end up, because, you know, talking to you is a pleasure, and of course it could go on and go on for a very long time, but nevertheless, you know, every beginning has to have an end. So my last question to you would be, that is, what is your, you know, message to the young aspiring women as poet and as in women in general?
I'm not sure women need any advice, really. You know, I think the thing is to inhabit yourself. I would say learn to inhabit yourself, because learn not to listen to the credos and platitudes of others. You know, many people ask me about who my role model was, and I always felt that the idea is not to become someone else. The idea is not to become a clone of someone else. That's why I'm not in favor of talking about women in mythology just because they exist in mythology. Do they speak to you? If they speak to you, there's a reason why they're important. So I would say to women everywhere, and in fact to human beings everywhere, I'd say, learn to become yourself. This is not about trying to become someone else. Become yourself. But at the same time, remember that the self and the world don't have to be at war. there is a way to turn anger into a celebration. There is a way to do it. I'm not there. I do it sometimes and I don't achieve it at other times. But there is a way to turn a rant into an anthem. And I think that's my quest as a poet.
Absolutely. Wonderful thoughts. Wonderful talking to you. So it's a pleasure having you here, and we look forward for further collaborations as well. So to see you in person and to interact with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Namaste.
so much, Swayamprabha. I'm so glad we met, really.
Bye.
Thank you.
So over to Akashdeep.
Yes, thank you so much, Arundhati madam and Swayamprabha madam also. It's really wonderful talk and wonderful moment to celebrate this Women's Day. Okay, actually, I don't think that one particular day is Women's Day, because every day is a Women's Day, because we are born from women, we grow up with a woman. And even though metaphorically, after our death, we also mix up with our Mother Earth. Okay. So thank you again to all the participants here, to the speakers overall. And we expect that after today, when you begin our conference tomorrow, okay, formally, so this energy and this power that we have generated from this talk, okay, will give us more power and will give extra energy to have a successful conference, the first South Asian International Conference. Okay. Thank you so much, madam. So we'll again, as Swayamprabha has also said, that we will meet in person, we expect. Okay. And I really thank you that you have provided us, though it was a talk scheduled for 20 minutes, but we have already crossed more than 20 minutes. Okay. But it was an unending talk. That is, it can be done for hours and hours. Okay. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad. My apologies if we went over time. It wasn't intentional. I'm
No,
sorry.
perhaps its apology should be from my end, because I couldn't control my inquisitiveness of asking you more and more and engrossing you in the talk. So never mind. I'm sure everybody must have had a good, some sort of festival we have created for this Women's Day. So thanks a lot. Have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Thank you.